Like if we're talking about this situation, it's because your team is struggling.
Your team could be fraudulent. And this is why neither one of these individually can paint the whole story, but together they can give you a really good idea of where you're at in the league and moves you might have to make. I will say this, is that I feel like if you're on the fence, it's more likely the better option to go towards rebuild, because going towards rebuild is less likely to end up in trouble years down the road, where if you try to make that final push, you might leave value on the table after the season if it ends up not going your way. The party don't start till I walk in. You might be at the point in your season where you're wondering whether it's time to rebuild or retool for next year. Well, you're in luck, because Zach and I are discussing what we look for when we're thinking about rebuilding. As always, I do hope y'all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. What questions do you ask yourself heading into a rebuild, and how do you start those rebuilds? But hey, with all that said, let's get right to the content you came for. Here with Zach today, and we're discussing to rebuild or not to rebuild. That is the question, Zach. Too often I see teams that, feel as though they're still competitive when they're really not. We've seen it in all our leagues. We've discussed it in the mistakes video a couple weeks ago. They overrate their own roster or fail to see that the cliff is coming for many of their players, and they still try to make that one last push for a championship, even though that might be a huge mistake. So in this video today, I really want to highlight the parameters that signify, hey, it's time to jumpstart that rebuild. You need to do it before too late. We always kind of discuss, be the first to rebuild. You don't want to rebuild too slow. You want to be the arms dealer at the trade deadline. That's going to be coming up in your league shortly enough, or at least to the point where teams are looking to make that playoff push when you might in fact be out of it, or kind of one of those pretenders teams. So for me, the big first parameter or thing I look at is, where do you stand within the league? This is huge. I mean, obviously, because, are you a playoff team? Are you a contender? Are you a championship contender? Or are you just kind of pretending? Or obviously, are you already in a rebuild? And what plays into this for me, this is a culmination of record, points for, max points for, points against. When it comes to this, Zach, where do you stand? What is the first thing you kind of look at when you need to decide whether it's time to rebuild or not to rebuild?
Yeah, the first thing that I look at really is, the context of the season thus far. If I'm hypothetically 0-5, am I losing by a lot? Am I losing because my players are injured? You touched on a lot of points there, Bob. And I think another good point to look at when determining how is the rest of my season going to go is, if you're in a 12-team league, you have a 14-game schedule. To me, I'm looking at who are the teams that I'm playing weeks 12, 13, and 14. How are those teams looking? Because am I realistically looking at a playoff opportunity here? Are those teams playoff contenders as well? Will those teams be selling off by that point? Will I have a realistic chance to win those games? Because, let's just say hypothetically, again, in this scenario, I'm playing the top 3 teams in the league. It's probably not great for me if my team is struggling. Like if we're talking about this situation, it's because your team is struggling. Right? It's not because your team is a title contender. It's because your team is struggling right now through the first 5-6 weeks of the fantasy season. So, a real big thing for me is, again, looking at those last 3 games and saying, who am I playing and where will their team be at that point in the season to determine whether I have a chance at making the playoffs or not? Because you do want to have a realistic scope as to whether your team can compete for a championship or not. But the first thing you got to do is make the playoffs. It's much easier to do if the opponents that you're playing for a second game are not the top 3 teams in the league. So I don't think a lot of people think about that, right? Who are your opponents weeks 12, 13, and 14? And how many buys do you have that week? It's not looking good for me in a certain league if week 14 I'm fighting for a playoff spot. So these are things you want to get a grasp on, because I agree with Bob's overall point is you don't want to be the 3rd or 4th team deciding to rebuild once title contenders and playoff contenders have already made the move to acquire a playoff piece, and they no longer have their 1st or 2nd round pick, which is what you would need in a trade. So it's a holistic approach. Like, where are you in your season? But what is the context for it? Why are you 0-5? Why are you 0-4? Do you have the worst points for or max points for in your league? But look at that last 3 games of your season and assess from there is really how I go about it first and foremost.
I think you touch on some awesome points there. And I wouldn't even say just those last 3 games. I'd say, once you get to a point where you're, like I said, like you said, having this tough discussion of like, where am I at as a team? Like, you're obviously struggling. You're not one of those surefire playoff teams. Look ahead at the schedule. What do you have to face going throughout the rest of your season? Have you already kind of passed the tough matchups? Are you heading on to greener pastures with facing teams that, aren't scoring highly each week? They're max points for, their points for, kind of middle of the row in the rest of the league. I think all of that plays a role. And I think another thing you really touched on that was awesome was the wanting to rebuild quickly, because once those teams make those moves, those highly competitive teams make those moves to other rebuilders or whatever to send their first round picks or send capital to go get those players, that they can't move that piece again. They can't move those pieces again. That trade is done. It's likely that, being that they're competing, they don't have a boatload of assets to move. Just usual, economy of a dynasty league is there's not usually teams with a ton of capital and ton of assets to move. Once that deal is done, that's one less person you have to trade with and one less trade partner you can get, rebuilding assets from. So I think that's awesome. But definitely looking at context in general, did injuries kind of screw you over to start the season? Are those guys coming back? Do you have Dak on the way back? Do you have other injured players? Do you have Jameson Williams who might be providing some value on the back end of the season? What kind of value do you have? Do you have a ton of bye weeks that are going to, wreck you certain weeks, or are they kind of spread out? I think all those are awesome points. But looking at the record, usually the most important because it does decide who ends up making the playoffs, but it tells the least amount of the story. Looking at points for, how many points are you getting into your lineup compared to the rest of the league? I always look at points for as it's a good gauge of who has a good team, but it's also a good gauge of who's setting the best lineups, because, if your percentage of points for to max points for is really low, like you're just trash at setting lineups, and that's okay. A lot of us are like that. That's okay. And then the max points for, this just really puts a huge perspective of how good a team is and how much the team is putting up for points against the rest of the league across all positions. And then, looking at points against, this is really important. If your max PF or points for are bottom 6 in the league, and so is your points against, but you still have a really good record, your team could be fraudulent. And this is why neither one of these individually can paint the whole story, but together they can give you a really good idea of where you're at in the league and moves you might have to make if you're not one of those top teams. But now that we know where we stand in the league, let's say we're in top 4, top 6, bottom 6, whatever you want to break it down as, where's the line of I can make a realistic push when it comes to where I stack up in the league, or where I feel I stack up in the league? Like I said, I look at it as numbers don't really lie, but they do leave out some context sometimes. So like you mentioned earlier, if you had Dak those first 4 weeks, would it make a real huge difference? Things like that. If you had those injured players, would it make a huge difference? Is kind of the aspect of thinking there. But for me, I really feel like if you're not a top 4 team in points for or max points for, even though 6 teams make the playoffs, and I know anything can happen in the playoffs, or at least I should say most leagues, 6 teams make the playoffs, it's just that much less likely that you can overcome the other teams if you are not sitting highly in those criterias. What do you think? Where is the line for you when it comes to when we look at the big picture of where we stand in the league and all of those things? Where do you think you have to be to make a real run, a realistic run? Because I know, like I said, if you can be the last team to make it in, and you can win it all. We've seen it. I've had it happen in my leagues. I'm sure you've had it happen in yours. Mm-hmm. I'm sure viewers at home have had it happen in theirs as well. And that's why I always get ripped when I say, teams that are 5th or 6th and make the playoffs aren't real contenders. But go ahead, Zach. What do you think the line is for? Do you just need to be a playoff team? Is that the bare minimum? I
pretty much use the general rule of, like, if I'm not a top 4 team, what do I need to do to get there? I'm not necessarily trying to eke into the playoffs. Now, again, a lot of this context depends. Like, does somebody else have my first round pick? Because then I don't care. Then I'm just trying to make the playoffs, right? A lot of it is context dependent. But what is my overall plan here? Is in Dynasty, the plan should not be a 1-year plan unless you're a top 2 team, a top 2 team in the league, right? Your plan should be 2022 and the next 5 years. That's how I maneuver almost every decision for the most part, unless I'm in the driver's seat to be in the championship game. So the context really matters, but for the most part, I'm trying to be top 4 because anything can happen in those playoff games. And let's give a good example. Last year, a lot of teams made the playoffs and won a championship because Rashad Penny got hot at the end of the year. And then if you played Justin Jackson week 17, he scored 30 points in the championship game. And that happened. That happened in some of my leagues. And it's like, dude, you just can't prep or plan or prepare for that. Now that depends on your league construct, how deep are the rosters. Some leagues are more for trading, some are very short roster sizes. So a lot of context depends there. But for me, if I'm not a top 4 team, then every move is what do I do to become a top 4 team? Because I really don't want to be in the middle of the first round in any draft. I want to be in the beginning because my team sucked, or I want to be in the end because I competed and had a realistic shot at the playoffs. So I'm always trying to be top 4. And if not, I'm trying to be bottom 4.
I definitely agree with that. Being out of the middle is huge. I feel like, to get out of the middle, it's almost, and we'll do a video on this at some point as well. But to get out of the middle, I feel like you have to go full rebuild and just, build up the assets for later is kind of the way to go. The way I look at it, and I like that you pointed this out, is that, if you're not a top 4 team, but maybe you are a top 6 team, what can you do to get into that top 4 tier? What moves can you make? Can you add a better wide receiver? Can you add a win now running back from one of those teams that are actually looking to rebuild? And this goes back to other videos that we've had in the past where it's, how do you send trades that actually get accepted? Look up that video. That's an awesome video to go look for in this case. But if you're already a high scorer, for me, it's just that much easier to justify going out and spending large amounts of capital on win now assets, because those moves can really put you over the edge to be where you might have been a top 4 team, but now you're the top 1 or 2 teams, and you're even probably in a tier by yourself with the players you get. Whereas if you're kind of in the middle of the row, the move you could make to add those win now assets just kind of make you competitive with those top win now teams, as opposed to making the move before where you were already a top 2 team. Now you're kind of in a tier by yourself. You should also note what's the gap between you and those top teams. Are you a top 4 team? This is an example I'll give in one of my own leagues. Are you a top 4 team, but the top team or the top 2 teams are just so far out of your league, out of your own league, that it's just like, man, unless that team has a really bad week, I can't hold a candle to them, and I don't have the assets to make the moves. I was in this very same situation where I had a very competitive team, but I could steamroll most teams. There were 2 teams or 2 or 3 teams in the league, that one team in particular that I just could not match with. So I'm like, I have Travis Kelce, had Austin Eckler, Mike Evans, a handful of other aging vets that once the season ticks over, they're going to be a heck of a lot less valuable. So I'm like, you know what? It's time to jumpstart the rebuild. And that was just looking inside myself.
Let me ask you a question, and I'm sure we might have touched on this in a few minutes, but I know that we talked about being the first to be the rebuilder. But when is that point? Like when, I know it's 5 weeks. So we've talked about the context of your team, max PF, points allowed, your schedule, the last 3 games, but it still feels early to me, even if I knew that my team was not contending, right? Yeah. And I'm speaking more so in a situation where I have seen teams be, a couple of years ago, 6-7, sneak into the playoffs and win the fantasy championship. I have seen that. So what is the time frame? Because I still feel like week 5, week 6 may be too soon, but I see the other side as well. Like, let me give you a perfect example. Aaron Jones, right? Aaron Jones on a rebuilding team serves no purpose. Where is that point to where you're selling off, and look, I know a lot of people have already committed to that. And I just think that that's a little bit crazy because again, there's money at stake every single year. Sure. Like if I'm in $100 league, I'm not tanking an entire season. I'm trying to win $1,000,
Yeah.
So, where is that line for you, Bob, where you decide like, look, this is it. I know that we've talked about what are the things to look for, but I don't know, because I still feel like week 5, week 6 is still a little soon when your teams or when your league's trade deadline is typically week 11, week 12.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with any of that. And I think it's an awesome point to bring up. I think it's one of those things where I've always been I'm in or I'm out. And this is kind of, everybody has to have their own kind of gut feel about this. But if I'm looking at this from a neutral perspective, where if I'm already, by the time this comes out, we'll have already had week 6 happen. So if I'm already, let's say 2-4, And I look at these things like record, obviously, points for, max points for, points against. And if my team hasn't been barred down with injuries, which is hard to believe that anybody has been barred down with injuries at this point. But if I'm looking at this and I just feel like my team is bottom 6 at this point, I don't know how I can feel it or believe that it's going to get any better. And now you don't have to necessarily sell off these players right away, but it is something when those to really be on the ball with is being ready to move these players once that trade market starts getting really hot, when these top teams want to start making these moves to, mortgage some of their future to win now, I think is kind of the key for me. But I don't have any qualms with, especially in big money leagues, absolutely play out the year, play out as far as you feel like you need to, because, that's even more of a case of, there's no more reason then to try to play out the season and just kind of see what happens, and where you land, it just kind of is what it is at that point. I get it. Cause at that point, if you're making the playoffs and you have even a sliver of a chance to, cash out on the league big, and especially if it's not all paid out to one spot, if you can get into third place, or if it pays out to fourth place, you need to win one playoff game, you cash out ahead, or at least get some money back, whatever the case is. When we're talking small money leagues or, even free leagues, it's one of those things where I'm going to pull the trigger early, because I'd much rather, especially if I have my own pick, I'd much rather just, if I feel like if I'm not cut out for this season, anybody who is trending down, especially once the season ticks over, basically when you look at this and if you think ahead to next year, and all those guys I listed before, Travis Kelce, Mike Evans, Aaron Rodgers, Austin Eckler, the second this season ends, if you look at those players and you think, oh man, if you have that kind of that gross feeling when you look at them after the season, when it comes to a value lens, those are guys, get them off my team. If you feel like there's going to be a massive dent put in those players, I'm that much more likely to. Yeah. And that's just my personal preference. That's just how I am and how I've always manage my teams in my leagues. If I'm going for the win, I want to still have that long-term vision in mind. But if I feel like I'm out of it, I don't have a realistic chance to win the league. And this was the team I pivoted off of to go full rebuild was a 3-0 team, or a 4-0 team heading into this week. I think 3-1 or 4-0. So, it was a good team. It was fourth place in the league. And like I said, I did not feel like I had a competent enough team or a deep enough roster to really compete with these higher end teams long term. And this was a case where I looked at max PF, points for, all of these things, and I did stack up pretty low on paper. I was the fourth place ranked in the team, but I think I was seventh when it came to kind of mixing up all those categories. So I'm like, you know what, man, I love this team, but it just wasn't my year. The first year I almost ran the table. I went 13-0, and then I lost week 1 of the playoffs, which was cool, but it is one of those unfortunate things. But I think I'm much better set off now if I would have tried, or compared to if I would have tried to go and make a playoff push, end up with pick 9 next year or pick 7 next year, whatever the case might have been. Now that pick is probably going to be top 3 or 4 at probably the worst, I would guess. It might even be higher than that. So I like that pick a lot more. Plus, I ended up getting 2 more firsts on top for this year, a few seconds, and a few thirds. And this is an IDP league too. So IDPs in second and third rounds, I'm getting premium talent still in the second and third rounds with those picks too. So it's one of those things where in this case, and the thing is it's not going to fit every case, but it's just a matter of these are the things I look at when I want to think about rebuilding, or I'm thinking about rebuilding, and hopefully there's some worthwhile advice there. But Zach, wrapping this up, is there anything else, to add into the discussion of, is it time to rebuild? Is it time to, stick it out and try to push through?
I think we've covered a lot of the bases. Just because, we said here, you don't want to be late to the party. Like, you also don't want, look, like I said, you can make the playoffs and win the championship. So you need to take into account all the things we've laid out here. Max PF, points against, the remaining part of your schedule, your injuries, injuries to other teams in the league. Like, it's not a black and white subject. Like, should you rebuild? Yes. No, it's not that simple. Like, you need to take into, and this is where we talked about in our Dynasty Mistakes videos, which if you want, you can link up here, Bob, or you can edit that out, whatever you want.
It'll be at the end of the video.
There you go. If you look at our Dynasty Mistakes videos, we talk about taking in new information and like analyzing that information. Don't just, Jonathan Taylor had a bad game, I'm going to sit him out. Oh, Gabe Davis hasn't had a good game in 3 weeks, I'm going to sit him out, like you did, you know?
Relax.
You have to sit there with this information, do a little bit of research, watch the Dynasty Rewind videos, and we'll help you out with this. But listen, it's not a black and white thing. You gotta use all the information you have at your disposal, and that's going to make you better than other people in your league because that's what they're not doing. They're not looking at points against or points for. How many points have you scored? How many points have you gone up against? Are you 5-0? But you're last in terms of points against, which means that you've had the easiest schedule in the league. Like people aren't looking at that. And if you do and make decisions based off that, you will be that much better than your league mates.
Yeah. I think this goes into a talking point of using all of the information at your disposal and not leaving anything out that could be helpful. And I think the big thing to note is just because your points for in one league is 500 and your points for in another league is 400 doesn't tell me anything. Tell me where you're at. In the points for, rank yourself where you're at. I think that tells a heck of a lot larger story because there's some leagues that are such high scoring that, hey man, I'm scoring 800 points already this season. I put up 800 points on the board. Yippee me. Well, you might be starting 10 guys and your points might be inflated. Besides that point, I think that you touched on a great point that it's not black and white and you kind of have to do this research. And there is a bit of gut check that comes into play, I think, when making that final decision. But I will say this is that I feel like if you're on the fence, it's more likely the better option to go towards rebuild, because going towards rebuild is less likely to end up in trouble years down the road, where if you try to make that final push, you might leave value on the table after the season if it ends up not going your way. To touch on another point that you said, Zach, where you don't want to be late to the party, to quote one of the best American pop stars, Kesha, the party don't start till I walk in. You're the one with the assets. You're the one that can make the moves when it's needed. And like I said, that comes down to your decision. Unfortunately, it's not something black and white where I can just be like, hey, if it's week 7 and you're 2-5, sorry, pal, you got to rebuild. Or you're 3-4, you got to rebuild. It's a little bit trickier than that, unfortunately. While that is it for this one, I do hope y'all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. What other questions might you be asking yourself when you're thinking about heading into a rebuild? If you decided, hey, it's time for me to rebuild my team, be sure to check out the video on your screen where we dive into how we approach our rebuilds. But hey, that's going to be it for us today. We will see y'all in the next one. But until then, y'all have a good one.
I need that Kesha quote on a graphic.
I'll do it.
We need that.
I'll get Anthony
on a graphic. All right.